Link's Awakening DX is more than a colorized remake of the original Link's Awakening released in 1993 by Nintendo. It's more than your standard Zelda adventure game, it's a piece of social commentary on games hidden well underneath solid core gameplay. The game itself is your run-of-the-mill Zelda game in which you beat a certain number of dungeons and then bosses in order to beat the final boss, and in doing so, the game itself. With every Zelda game, finishing it is vital to its significance and impact, and in no other game than Link's Awakening is this more true. Usually what will happen at the end of any other Zelda game is you'll simply be commended for your efforts and thanked for saving the world from evil, thus giving you that feeling of satisfaction when you finish any game. In Link's Awakening, however, the ending is more than that. From the very start of your journey, you're told by a very wise owl that you must wake the Windfish if you want to know what's going on. And in order to do this, you must gather all 8 magical instruments, and then play a song where he rests. This, of course, sets you off on an epic adventure with nothing but a sword and shield to your name and the promise of rich magical goodies at the end of all this. Later in your journey, you start to gather hints as to what's really going on, as some of the nightmares, or red bosses if you will taunt you by saying things like, "It's all just a dream, you mustn't wake the Windfish or you and I will disappear." You're of course utterly confused by all this, but you still carry on, hoping that the Windfish will offer a valid explanation for everything going on around you. The owl will often tell you where you need to go next, and after the nightmares start telling you that everything's basically not real, the owl will tell you that you have to carry on and wake the Windfish if you want to know the truth. So naturally you have no choice but to carry on. You could always say no and turn off the game, but that wouldn't be all that fun, now would it? By this point, only 3 dungeons stand in your way of finding out the truth, so you go into overdrive mode and finally collect all of the magical instruments. You then make it to the very top of the island, where the egg of the Windfish rests, and play the Song of Awakening. After playing the song, the egg will burst and you will be able to step inside. You then beat the boss, or not, and try again. And finally, you're face to face with the Windfish, who then tells you that yes, Koholint Island and its inhabitants are but a dream. He then goes on to say that you shouldn't lament, as the journey was still very real. The challenges you faced and the foes you defeated stand as a test to your wisdom, strength and bravery. Now the island is pretty much fake, but the memory of it is not, and it's one you always carry with you. The Windfish's explanation is much deeper than you'd think at first glance. Much like Koholint Island, the game itself isn't real, but the adventure very much is. As the Windfish, and Link, awakens, so must you. You must realize that the game has come to an end, which shouldn't sadden you, as the journey you had was real and the memory of it will stick to you. The game is practically a game of a game done well. Its commentary is hidden well and ambiguous, thus not breaking any immediate fourth wall. The game never tries to be pretentious about what it's trying to say, nor does it really hammer on about the real and not real parts about it. And that's really how you remember it years from now, as a game that went all the way and took its sweet time trying to teach you something. Beating the game can take up to 15 hours if you've never played it before. The puzzles are challenging and the lack of a guide or aid really does force you to explore if you want to advance at all. Scattered across the island are phone booths that do give you advice on where to go next, but using them is entirely optional, and the advice that's given is usually pretty cryptic, which means you'll still need to rely on your wits to pull you through a dungeon or event. Dungeons themselves are fairly challenging as well. The first few dungeons are difficult because you've only got about 3 hearts, which increases the chances of dying early on. The later dungeons, however, don't let up at all, and you may be forced to look up a walkthrough because you simply can't find the solution. The game can definitely be unforgiving at times. Hearts are hard to come by, shop items can be very expensive, and some events will drive you crazy if you're unsure as to what you're supposed to do next. Even the first few bosses are some of the most difficult ones in the entire game. To beat the first boss, you need to simply whack at his tail until he stops living. However, if you fall through any of the holes in the floor, you'll drop down to the basement, which means you've left the boss room, and the boss's health will be back to full once you make it back to him. Luckily for me, I found a power-up that doubled my sword's damage, so I only had to hit him a few times to bring him down, which means this is a pretty bad example. Yes, there are power-ups in this game. A glowing triangle that resembles a Triforce, which doubles your sword's damage and will send enemies flying when you hit them, and an acorn that will reduce the damage you sustain from getting hit by enemies or falling down holes. Every enemy you slay can drop arrows, bombs, hearts, rupees, which is the standard currency in every Zelda game, or one of these 2 power-ups. The chance an enemy will drop one of these power-ups is fairly slim, which means you definitely won't be running around pulling enemies like some kind of superhero. Their effects also wear off after a while or after you get hit a bunch of times, which ultimately makes the power-ups well balanced. Because of the fast-paced action in Link's Awakening, these power-ups work well, and I understand why they're not in any 3D Zelda games, as the more relaxed pace of these games would severely damage the use of a timed power-up that isn't all that common to begin with. Here's another example of how unforgiving the game is. Throughout the game, you'll meet people with whom you can trade an item for a different item. This trade chain, if you will, eventually leads to the final item, which is the magnifying lens. The magnifying lens works similarly to how the Lens of Truth works in Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask, in that you need it to see certain things you couldn't otherwise see. In the Windfish's Egg there is a puzzle area which you can only pass if you know the right direction to go in. You can only find the solution if you've got the magnifying lens in your inventory, as the direction to go in is randomized in every playthrough. With the lens you can also find some other things you wouldn't otherwise be able to find, which are entirely optional to your playthrough or enjoyment of the game. The trade chain is fairly long, and because areas of the map are locked off until you get an item that will allow you to reach the location, you'll spend the entire game trading items with NPCs. The game offers a lot of content. You can go fishing, look for treasure, or blitz through the main story quest to get to the ending. As is common in every Zelda game, you can hunt for pieces of heart which increase your maximum amount of hearts, thus making it harder for enemies to kill you. The DX version also features a newly implemented color dungeon, an entirely optional dungeon that yields a very special reward at the end. But does this game hold up to today's standards? Is it a timeless classic like, say, Tetris or Pac-Man? Well, I wouldn't go so far as to say that Link's Awakening DX is one of the greatest gamers of all time. I'd definitely argue that it's still relevant today. If you've played any of the later portable 2D Zelda games, you'll definitely recognize enemies and maybe even some parts of the dungeons, meaning you may not be as impressed as I was when I first played Link's Awakening DX. And to be fair, modern 3D games are definitely more fun gameplay-wise and more fleshed out than Link's Awakening is. Then again, this game came out in 1993 for the original Game Boy, and the DX version was released 5 years later for the Game Boy Color. And for a game this old to teach something that's still as valid and applicable now as it was 20 years ago, it definitely deserves to be played and remembered for years and years to come. Ultimately, I had a lot of fun playing this game again, and if there's anyone out there who wasn't put off by the spoiler warning at the beginning, I definitely recommend that you play it yourself and really experience it firsthand.